My name is Assata Shakur, and I was born and raised in the United States. I am a descendant of Africans who were kidnapped and brought to the Americas as slaves. I spent my early childhood in a racist, segregated South. I later moved to the northern part of the country, where I realized that Black people were equally victimized by racism and oppression. I grew up and became a political activist, participating in student struggles, the anti-war movement, and most of all, in the movement for the liberation of African Americans in the United States. I later joined the Black Panther Party, an organization that was targeted by the COINTELPRO program, a program that was set up by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to eliminate all political opposition to the U.S. government's policies, to destroy the Black liberation movement in the United States, to discredit activists, and to eliminate potential leaders. Under the COINTELPRO program, many political activists were harassed, imprisoned, murdered, or otherwise neutralized. As a result of being targeted by COINTELPRO, I, like many other young people, was faced with the threat of prison, underground, exile, or death. The FBI, with the help of local police agencies, systematically fed false accusations and fake news articles to the press, accusing me and other activists of crimes we did not commit. Although in my case the charges were eventually dropped or I was eventually acquitted, the national and local police agencies created a situation where, based on their false accusations against me, any police officer could shoot me on sight. It was not until the Freedom of Information Act was passed in the mid-'70s that we began to see the scope of the United States government's persecution of political activists. At this point, I think that it is important to make one thing very clear. I have advocated, and I still advocate, revolutionary changes in the structure and in the principles that govern the United States. I advocate self-determination for my people and for all oppressed people inside the United States. I advocate an end to capitalist exploitation, the abolition of racist policies, the eradication of sexism, and the elimination of political repression. If that is a crime, then I am totally guilty. To make a long story short, I was captured in New Jersey in 1973 after being shot with both arms held in the air and then shot again from the back. I was left on the ground to die, and when I did not, I was taken to a local hospital where I was threatened, beaten, and tortured. In 1977, I was convicted in a trial that can only be described as a legal lynching. In 1979, I was able to escape with the aid of some of my fellow comrades. I saw this as a necessary step, not only because I was innocent of the charges against me, but because I knew that the racist legal system in the United States, I would receive no justice. I was also afraid that I would be murdered in prison. I later arrived in Cuba, where I am currently living in exile as a political refugee. The New Jersey State Police and other law enforcement officials say they want to see me brought to justice. But I would like to know what they mean by justice. Is torture justice? I was kept in solitary confinement for more than 2 years, mostly in men's prisons. Is that justice? My lawyers were threatened with imprisonment and imprisoned. Is that justice? I was tried by an all-white jury without even the pretext of impartiality and then sentenced to life in prison plus 33 years. Is that justice? Let me emphasize that justice for me is not the issue I am addressing here. It is justice for my people that is at stake. When my people receive justice, I am sure that I will receive it too.
Mm, mm, mm. Come on with it. I feel like we should just end this episode right there because there's absolutely nothing I can say that can compete with that monologue. But I know how much y'all love to listen to my voice, so I'm not going to do that to you. You may be surprised to hear that the voice you just heard was the first woman placed on the FBI's most wanted list. She was also Tupac's godmother. Her name is Assata Shakur, and this episode of the Breeze podcast will most likely get me in trouble 10 years from now. However, at this present moment in time, I believe her radicalism is exactly the leadership we need from our own civil rights leaders. A woman that twice represented herself during murder charges, Shakur is the embodiment of a self actualized, empowered Black woman. Currently living in political exile in Cuba, she continues to be a lightning rod for progressive activists and conservative cop worshippers. My name is Dre Breezy, and welcome to the Breeze Podcast. Assata Shakur was born Joanne Deborah Chesimard on July 16, 1947, in New York City. Her background is very much like my own. She was the daughter of a school teacher and split her time living in Wilmington, North Carolina, my home state, and New York after her parents' divorce. For some of you that don't know, my mother's family is from New York, and I've spent quite a bit of time there. Shakur was intelligent and curious, but also very rebellious. And because of that rebellious attitude, she was sent to live with her aunt, Evelyn Williams, at a very young age. Despite Williams' support, the troubled teen quit high school and got a low wage job. Eventually, she met some African students at a bar and had conversations with them about the state of the world, including the Vietnam War. The discussion about Vietnam marked a turning point for Shakur. I never forgot that day, she said. We're taught at such an early age to be against communists, yet most of us don't have the faintest idea what communism is. Only a fool lets somebody else tell him who the enemy is. Afterwards, she studied at both the Borough of Manhattan Community College, BMCC, and the City College of New York. As a college student in the 1960s, she was very politically active. She joined the Black activist group, the Olden Drums, and fought for Black representation and equity in her community. One of these fights was at BMCC when she and other students chained the entrance to a building to draw attention to the college's dearth of Black professors and its lack of a Black studies department. Through her activism, Shakur met her husband, Louis Chesimard, who was also a student activist. They were only married for a year. Shakur says they divorced over conflicts over gender roles. After her divorce, she traveled to California to assist with the Native American occupation of Alcatraz. The Native American community was upset with the continued betrayal of treaties and compacts that were made by the American government. To learn more about these atrocities in Native American history, listen to my episode on the Native American genocide in this country on earlier podcasts. Maybe a podcast, maybe it was last year. In 1971, she travels back to New York and changes her name to Assata Olug Bala Shakur. Assata means she who struggles, Olug Bala means love for the people, and Shakur means the thankful. We see this trend happening a lot in the 60s with the Black liberation activists changing their names to more African or more culturally Black names because in many ways it's a sort of reclaiming of the heritage. You know, we saw it with Malcolm X. We saw it with Muhammad Ali as well. Shakur then proceeds to grow out an afro and join the Black Panthers. As established in the Fred Hampton episode, the Black Panthers were not opposed to violently resisting white supremacy, and they were also active in helping the community, creating free breakfast programs for children and medical clinics for adults. She actually ends up leaving the Black Panthers because she felt that they weren't educated enough on Black history nor self reflective enough. This is when she started being surveilled by COINTELPRO, which was an FBI operation discussed in the last episode. Becoming disillusioned with the Black Panthers led her to join the Black Liberation Army, a group that can firmly be described as radical. Shakur was involved with quite a few criminal or questionable activities. According to law enforcement, between April 5th, 1971 and January 23rd, 1973, Shakur was alleged to have committed a series of violent crimes, sometimes alongside other members of the BLA. Shakur was accused 6 times for crimes that include 2 bank robberies in New York, the kidnap and murder of a drug dealer, armed robbery, during which she was shot, and the attempted murder of policemen in an ambush. For many of these trials, she represented herself with the assistance of her Aunt Evelyn. On each of the 6 occasions, Assata Shakur was found not guilty through dismissals, mistrials, acquittals, and a hung jury. It later emerged that in 1973, the FBI had 2 separate task forces, COINTELPRO and CHESROB, which had been an evolution of New Kill, attempting to tie Shakur to any and every violent activity on the East Coast of the United States as a way to discredit the Black Liberation Army. This is a very important fact and completely explains why Shakur has not returned to the U.S. to seek justice. Why seek justice from a land or a country that has no interest in it? In 1972, Shakur was the subject of a nationwide manhunt after the FBI alleged that she was the revolutionary mother hen of the Black Liberation Army cell that had conducted a series of cold-blooded murders of New York City police officers, including the execution-style murders of New York police officers Joseph Piagentini and Waverly Jones on May 21, 1971, as well as Gregory Foster and Rocco Laurie on January 28, 1972. There were wanted posters placed all over New York City subways. The FBI also colluded with the media to portray Shakur as extremely violent, unstable, and aggressive. Shakur was alleged to have been directly involved with the Foster and Laurie murders, and as well as being involved with the Piagentini and Jones murders. Some sources go further, identifying Shakur as the de facto leader and the soul of the Black Liberation Army, after the arrest of co-founder Dhoruba Moore. Robert Daley, deputy commissioner of the New York City Police at the time, for example, described Shakur as the final wanted fugitive, the soul of the gang, the mother hen who kept them together, kept them moving, and kept them shooting. On May 2nd, 1973, Shakur was in a car with 2 BLA members, Sundiata Akoli and her close friend Zaid Malik Shakur. State Trooper James Harper stopped them on the New Jersey Turnpike. Another trooper, Werner Forster, followed in a different patrol car. During the stop, a gunfight ensued. There are varying accounts of what happened, but ultimately, Werner Forster and Zaid Shakur were killed, and Assata Shakur and Harper were wounded. Forensic evidence shows that Shakur was shot with her hands up, and none of her fingerprints were found on any of the guns, nor was any gunpowder found on any of her clothes. Shakur was later charged with the murder of Forster and spent several years incarcerated before her trial. She spent 21 months in solitary confinement in the basement of a men's prison and was tortured continuously by law enforcement. Somehow, throughout all of this, she ended up pregnant and gave birth in 1974. Like so many trials for Black people in America, this trial was rigged. The jury was biased. As stated earlier, the FBI used the media to paint all Black nationalists and revolutionaries as terrorists. And that's what the vast majority of white America believed. Oh, yeah. And the jury was composed of all white people. The defense team had their offices bugged, their documents were stolen and leaked to the New York City Police Department, and the judge consistently showed a bias toward Shakur and her defense team. When expert forensic evidence began to show that there was no way that Shakur could have pulled the trigger of a gun due to her injuries, Judge Theodore Appleby cut off funding for expert forensic advice for the defense. We've seen modern incarnations of these sham trials with white police officers that murder Black people with impunity and then face no consequences. Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Carlos Lopez, and Michael Brown come to mind. Shakur's trials were added to the long list of fraudulent charades of justice that Black people face when navigating our criminal injustice system. Ultimately, she was found guilty on all 8 counts, 2 murder charges and 6 assault charges, and was given a mandatory life sentence. 2 years after her murder conviction, BLA members and other activists posed as visitors to the prison and broke Shakur out. She lived underground for several years and eventually fled to Cuba in 1984. The nation's then leader, Fidel Castro, granted her asylum. After 29 years living in exile, writing, being a mother, and just living her best life, in 2013, the FBI put her on the most wanted terrorist list. The FBI presented no evidence against her and revealed no new terrorist plots. Assata's real crime, FBI spokesman Aaron Ford said, was that from Cuba she continues to maintain and promote her ideology and provides anti-U.S. government speeches espousing the Black Liberation Army message, an ideology and message that the U.S. government has declared terrorism. So just a quick fun fact. Luis Posada Carriles was a former CIA operative who currently walks free in Miami. He publicly admitted to the New York Times that he had engaged in a campaign of fatal hotel bombings in Cuba. In 1976, Posada was a key figure in the bombing of a Cuban airliner where 73 people died. In 2000, Posada was caught attempting to set up a plot to assassinate Fidel Castro as he spoke to university students in Panama. If successful, the attack would have killed hundreds. America has plenty of love for terrorists that attack groups that they deem as problematic. That is why so many police officers were woefully unprepared for the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, because they inherently view those terrorists as not that bad, and they sympathize with their goals. The American government is relentless in destroying the Black civil rights movement, as established in the last episode. The FBI and CIA conducted an aggressive program of intimidation and harassment to all Black civil rights leaders and attached criminality to their actions regardless of the validity of those accusations. Shakur's case is no different. The state was committed to punishing her for crimes of speaking out against injustice. Honestly, reading the court documents, the accusations being lobbied against Shakur had very little evidence, very little connection to the truth, and they were mostly hearsay. American administrations make the argument that they continue the Cuban embargo because they harbor terrorists such as Shakur. However, once again, American hypocrisy shines brightly because, as established time and time again, America doesn't have a problem with terrorism. We support terrorism all over the globe through foreign interference and secret coups. We created a whole base in Cuba just so we could torture people. What America really has a problem with is anyone that pulls away the veil of bullshit exceptionalism and brings attention to all the many ways that capitalism and domestic policy fails minorities, specifically Black people. Stories like Assata Shakur and Fred Hampton makes the American position very clear. White supremacy is the law of the land, and if you don't submit, they will destroy you. The reason I'm telling her story is not so you will find purpose in attacking law enforcement. The reason I'm telling her story is because we literally don't learn this shit in school. We learn that all Black leaders were nonviolent, like MLK, and we are brainwashed to believe if we just continue to nicely ask white people for equality, we'll get it, when history constantly shows us that we have to fight. Shakur is a living martyr and one of the few leaders that survived being the target of American racism and imperialism. If you want to learn more about her story, she wrote an autobiography in 1988, and I've placed it on the top of my reading list. For more of my podcasts and my own writing, you can go to www.findthebreeze.com. Happy Black History Month, and start switching out that wardrobe because spring is coming.